We start? Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this panel discussion on social cohesion in displacement towards evidence-based practice. It's great to see some of you here in the room. I think people will continue to trickle in over the next few minutes, so we'll just kickstart anyway because we have a large number of people also joining us online. So hopefully you can all hear me in the room and online. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, for those of you who are listening in online, auto captioning is available during this event, and you can access that by clicking at the button on the bottom of your screen. And we'll also have a Q&A session after the panelist interventions. And if you're online, you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will read some of those out for you. And finally, just a reminder that this event is being recorded. The video will be available on ODI's webpage and podcast channel. So my name is Caitlin Sturridge. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at ODI's Humanitarian Policy Group. I am responsible for HPG's research on displacement, and I'm going to chair today's panel. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We have Babu Oyindo, who is a teacher, storyteller, and researcher in peace building. He is currently a senior advisor for peace and governance at Mercy Corps, and he has been working on community-based social cohesion and peace building efforts for over 3 decades. Babu, welcome. Jane Mary Ruhundwa, nice to see you here as well. Jane Mary is the co-founder and executive director of Dignity Kwanza. This is a Tanzanian NGO that supports people affected by displacement through advocacy, legal assistance, and community empowerment. Jane Mary worked with ODI on the Tanzanian component of a 2-year research project on social cohesion on displacement, and it's great to have her on the panel. Thank you. Dr. Mike Awiso, welcome to the panel. Mike teaches at Maseno University in the School of Development and Strategic Studies, where he is also the Dean. Mike is a senior visiting research fellow at King's College London, and his research centres on migration and displacement. And before entering into academia, Mike worked in the humanitarian sector for over 17 years, so he has lots of relevant experience to bring to this panel. Andrew, welcome to the panel as well. Andrew Miner is the Regional Durable Solutions Coordinator at REDS, which is the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat. He has a background in law and international relations, and he previously worked with the Refugee Consortium of Kenya. And last but by no means least, we have Corey Rogers. Corey is Assistant Professor of Migration Studies at the Lebanese American University. From 2020 to 2023, he led research by the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre, which examined humanitarian strategies to promote social cohesion between refugees and local communities in Kenya and Lebanon. So now that we've met the panelists, I'm going to give you a bit of context about this session and what you can expect. So this is the first of 2 sessions. This first session is hybrid, so we have people here in the room and people online, and it will be followed by a second in-person session for those of us who are here in Nairobi. So this hybrid session, the aim is to explore the evidence base on social cohesion. We're bringing together key aid actors, academics, and people with lived experience to discuss social cohesion in displacement, with a focus on East Africa. The workshop will be an opportunity to explore new academic research on these issues and also to share key lessons in policy and practice. It will also hopefully be an opportunity to network with key actors working on and thinking about some of these issues. And drawing on their work and experience, our panelists will discuss a range of topics. Some of the key questions that we'll be discussing in this panel are: what does social cohesion look like in the context of East Africa? What factors undermine or drive social cohesion? What role should aid actors play in influencing social relations? And what needs to happen to promote better social cohesion? Sorry, I'm just fiddling around with my slides. Okay. So before handing over to our panelists and their interventions, I wanted to briefly talk to you about some research that HBG has been doing on social cohesion in displacement. For the past 2 years, we have been exploring refugee-host relations with a focus on Tanzania and Pakistan. Our research sought to address 2 key questions. The first was how important is social cohesion in refugee settings? And the second was around the role that aid actors should play in supporting social cohesion. A key question that emerged from our research was, should social cohesion be a primary goal of aid interventions or a secondary objective of wider practice? In other words, to what extent should aid actors seek to influence complex social relations through specific interventions designed to build social cohesion? In our policy brief published just a couple of months ago, and you can see a screenshot of that on the right-hand side of this slide, we recommended that aid actors step back or avoid addressing social cohesion as a primary objective unless their interventions meet 4 key requirements. And I'll quickly talk you through what those requirements are over the next few slides, if I can work them. Okay, so the first requirement is around clarity of thought and purpose. In other words, does the intervention that is being designed and implemented by aid actors, does it address a specific aspect of social cohesion that is rooted in people's own experiences and priorities? If it doesn't, then we argue that aid actors should step back from seeking to influence social cohesion as a primary objective. The second requirement is about pragmatism, about the limitations and risks. Does the intervention recognize its own limitations and mitigate against the risks of unintended consequences? If not, then again, we argue that aid actors should step back. The third requirement relates to equity and transparency. We asked, does the intervention combine fair targeting with clear messaging about how aid is distributed? If not, then again, we suggest that aid actors should step back from social cohesion as a primary objective. And the fourth and final requirement is around political coherence. Does the intervention adequately consider the wider politics of social cohesion? If not, then again, we argue that aid actors should step back. In practical terms, stepping back can mean different things. It can mean pausing in order to take stock and adapt programming. Stepping back can also mean narrowing the focus, focusing on specific aspects of social cohesion where aid can have the most meaningful impact. Lastly, stepping back can also mean standing down altogether. To be clear, though, stepping back doesn't mean ignoring social cohesion or social relations. All aid interventions influence social relations, often in unintended or unpredictable ways. And with this in mind, aid actors must always take social relations seriously and ensure that their actions and their interventions are conflict sensitive and do no harm. Struggling with my slides. Maybe you can, so building on these findings, it's time to turn to our 5 panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to make a short 5-minute intervention on different aspects of social cohesion in displacement. And after that, we'll turn to the Q&A, where it will be your opportunity to pose your questions. So Babu, I'm going to start with you. Mercy Corps has recently launched a new handbook for supporting social cohesion. Can you set the scene by telling us what is social cohesion as you understand it, and why does it matter in the context of East Africa? You've got 5 minutes, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Before I speak to you about Coalesce, our approach in Mercy Corps to social cohesion, I just want to share with you that this morning, when I was on the taxi coming here, I thought, what did influence a lot of the social cohesion and the peace building work I've been engaged in? I was very lucky. growing up in Western Kenya in a rural village and being raised by my grandparents. And one of the things my grandparents taught me was that every human being is born inherently good. And I saw my grandfather, the way he interacted with people, even when he was resolving problems. He was a great mediator, negotiator in the community. He believed in that we are inherently good. And I think to a large degree, that has influenced the way I approach issues of social cohesion and peace building. Now, in my time with Masiko and talking about social cohesion with the community, we kept asking, what image comes to your mind when you hear social cohesion? How would you translate it in our own languages? And what you have on the screen are just but a selection of some of those. It is the glue that binds the society. We all know about Ubuntu, or even the way the Xhosa people talk about umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. You are only a person amongst people. So we derive our energy for thriving, for social change from others, the collective. So that is the foundation, if you will, for cooperation and building a very strong community and building a very strong society. I was talking to my sister here in the morning. How do we transliterate or translate social cohesion into Kiswahili or even other languages? You know, in Kenya here, you may know we have a whole commission. We talk about uwiano. But my sister, we also talked about mshikamano, ama utengamano. And there could be others, which shows the uniqueness about how we understand social cohesion in any context. And I'll come back to that. So in Masiko, our coalesce approach, our research and our practice tells us that is that sense of trust, the key words, trust, shared purpose, and a willingness to engage and cooperate. And we've broken that down in the right side of the slide. What does trust mean? The collective action and the norms, the civic engagement, the sense of belonging, identity, attitude towards the others, or what you might call the outgroup. And some good examples we've seen in Uganda, the Women Peace Forum in Karamoja in Uganda are doing wonderful work that in the midst of all the conflicts, they're able to find ways, pathways to transcend some of the challenges and bring people together, including local leaders, cultural leaders, government agencies, in continuing the difficult work of strengthening the fabric of their own communities and their society, enhancing social cohesion and collective action on the urgent and priority issues. So in the next slide then, in Masiko, we talk about coalesce. If we look at the basic dictionary definition, coalesce means growing together or uniting for a common end, or to arise from the combination from distinct elements. We acknowledge, you know, though my grandparents were saying we are all born inherently good, but at the same time, there are those difficult moments and those difficult challenges. How do we transcend those to grow together? So coalesce basically means collective action and local engagement for social cohesion. That is the basic approach in Masiko. And I might say on a light tone is also a contribution to the many acronyms in the NGO cycle. So what does that mean? Just in summary, collective action and local engagement for social cohesion. So in the next slide, we break it down. Yeah. So what does that actually mean, the collective action? Community dialogues, we foster social and cultural engagement. This we have done very well in Karamoja in Uganda, parts of Tanzania, and also here in Kenya, strengthening conflict management capacity. Because conflicts will always be there. We are very different. Though we are born inherently good, there'll be difficulties. But the idea is we need to have that capacity internally, locally, to resolve our conflicts in a way that enhances, strengthen the social fabric of the society. That we believe that community should have the creativity, the empathy, and creative ways of resolving their own conflicts peacefully. That we're endowed with a lot of natural resources. In many of the places we work in, Mexico operates in about 40 countries. There are a lot of natural resources that we are able to manage them, share them equitably, and if problems do arise, we have the capacity to resolve those problems. Then finally, facilitate opportunities for groups to engage in collective action across lines of division. This for us is very important. We're all inherently good. We'll all have our issues. There'll be lines of division, but can we retain that spirit, that idea that we can work jointly, no matter those divisions? So I will leave it at that, and I might have some more to say later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Babu. Jo Mary, I'm going to turn to you now for your 5-minute intervention. Last year, your organization, Dignity Kwanza, partnered with us on a 2-year research on social cohesion in Tanzania. Building on the findings of this study, can you tell us what social relations between refugees and hosts looks like in the context of Tanzania? And maybe tell us a little bit also about how and why social relations can differ across different places in Tanzania, maybe with a focus on camp settings and towns and cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Social cohesion in Tanzania, as you just correctly said in your question, differ depending on where refugees live, the living setting of refugees. So many people know that Tanzania has refugee camps, but what they might not know is that in Tanzania, refugees live in 4 different settings. Camps is one of them where majority of refugees reside in, but there are settlements which have been there for decades, over 5 decades. There are also refugees, a substantial number of refugees living in villages, and a smaller number of recognized refugees living in urban settings, mostly in Dar es Salaam and Kigoma, but also large number of those, but not documented. So those are the 4 different settings. And refugee-host relations are defined based on those settings. So from our research, we found that in villages and settlements, so maybe I should tell the difference between settlements and camps. So settlements are more or less like villages. The setup of a settlement is like a village, except that they're designated for refugees, where initially they just lived as refugees only, but slowly there were few Tanzanians, host community who were there, but just few compared to the refugees. And later on, more host members started moving in those settlements. So they are more or less like villages, but also you need permission to get in and get out. But refugees would have large piece of land, will be self-reliant, and they'll just do not depend on humanitarian assistance. While camps, designated for refugees and refugees only, they get out by permit, and host community will only get in by permit and for specific reasons. And then they don't have it's just a place to live and a small area to garden. They rely on humanitarian assistance. So that is the difference. So in our findings, we found that settlements, the relations in the settlements and in the villages where refugees live alongside Tanzanians were positive and good. And especially in the villages, refugees and host members would go to the same schools, would use all same social services, would go through tough and difficult times and good times together. They would participate in each other's weddings. The children will intermarry. So the social relations are good. And this is where I remember not just one, several participants saying, whenever we asked a question about refugees, they'll be like confused. And because they don't refer to them as refugees, they call them citizens to be. In Swahili, they call them watarajiwa, that they're waiting for them to become Tanzanians, because they have intermingled to that extent that they feel that they're fellow Tanzanians and there's no difference except the legal part of them becoming citizens. In the settlements as well, we found that, and another fact I didn't mention in the settlement is most of the refugees who are in the settlements are now citizens because they were granted they were granted citizens by the government of Tanzania. There are just few refugees who stay there. So we interviewed refugees as well as the naturalized Tanzanians as well as native Tanzanians. And the relations are generally good. And this is because, again, these communities have been living together for a very long time, interacting, sharing social services that are available in the settlements. Coming to the second setting, the camp, where there's no interactions whatsoever. The interactions that are there, mostly I would call them transactional, where maybe refugees will go to host community to buy certain stuff and come back. There were years where there was a common market, which kind of really helped to build social cohesion, but not so much because it was still, again, we meet in the market, we do business, and then we leave. There's no time to build friendship, social relations, and such and things like that. And another thing that we found in the camps is because of the nature of the camp, it pushes the relations that come out of that setting to be sort of confrontational, because apart from going to markets once in a while to buy things or coming to camps once in a while to use medical services, other times that refugees would interact or would meet with hosts is when they go to fetch firewood, where they have lived in that area for many years, and then firewood is a big concern. So they would end up in Tanzanians' farms getting firewood. So you see the contact is already confrontational. You are in my farm collecting firewood, you are destroying my crops and all that. Or a refugee has left a camp without permit or permission, and then he's bullied or abused by Tanzania because the Tanzanian know that there's nothing you can do because you are out here illegally. So those are the kind of relations. And this is where we found at least one person I interviewed personally said, what is social cohesion? It doesn't mean anything to me. And lastly, in urban areas, it was another interesting, we had interesting findings where you could say there's no social relations whatsoever. For refugees who are there legally, they live, that is big, so they are scattered, live in different areas. But even though they are registered and documented, they feel that they are not understood by the community. So social good relations are there before the hosts know that they are refugees. The moment they say they are refugees, they start being looked at suspiciously. So one respondent asked, what kind of social relations is there if we are friends when you don't know who I am, and then once you know, we are not. And for those who are undocumented, they don't even want to have those kind of social relations because it's dangerous to them. So those are the dynamics of social relations in the context of Tanzania.
Thanks, Jane Mary. That was really useful scene setting of what social relations can look like in a place like Tanzania. Mike, I'm going to turn to you. I want to talk with you a little bit about the relevance of national policy when it comes to social relations and social cohesion. And using the Sharika Plan as an example, but you're welcome to use other national policies as well. Can you elaborate on how national policy and national rhetoric have influenced social cohesion in Kenya? Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Perhaps it might be good to begin by looking at what I call policy enactments and proposals in Kenya, wherein the Sharika Plan also lies. And we can talk about, of course, the Constitution of Kenya and its provisions. We have the Refugee Act of 2021 and its regulations. We have the Kenya Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework of 2021. We have the Nairobi Declaration, which we can talk about. We have now the Kalobey Gisedep. We have Gisedep in Garissa. We have the county integrated development plans as building blocks to what I call the policy environment. We can also talk about the Shirika plan, which I will focus on in a moment. We also have the support for host community and refugee empowerment and its action plan, which is in place in Kenya. Of course, lately we have the bottom-up transformation agenda, better, which now is driving Kenya's development agenda. We have the medium-term plans. We have plan number 4 right now, and other policy enactments, proposals. Lately, we have Nairobi County has now a draft plan for working with and integrating refugees in the country, which is yet to be launched. But what do they provide for? All these array of policy / legal proposals. One, they provide for human rights. If you take a good read at them, there's a provision for human rights. There's a provision for socioeconomic inclusion. There's a provision for socioeconomic protection. They also talk about provision of safe water, adequate healthcare. They talk about quality education and training. They talk about self-sufficiency for refugees. They talk about employment, which leads to well-being and livelihoods. And they also talk about integrated development planning. But a closer look at the Shirika plan and its objectives, we see the alleviation of the strain on hosting as an objective of the Shirika plan. We see the transition to settlements. We see socioeconomic inclusion and delivery of basic services. A closer look at the Shirika plan also reveals that there are pillars. And these pillars talk about systems building. We talk about equity, equality, inclusion, and so on. Integrated services delivery as another pillar, which mainly focuses on access to services. We have a pillar on human capital and skills development. We have a pillar on sustainable natural resource management, another one on sustainable economic development, and the last one on durable solutions and coordinated pathways. So that is what the Shirika plan, looks like. The Shirika plan, of course, provides for what they call settlements. There's a proposal that refugees will now live in settlements. However, the regulations, which have not been finalized, does not clearly. We are not clear on what these settlements will look like, what these settlements will be. Will the settlements include hosts, or what do we see happening? But bottom line is the encampment policy. In all this, we see the encampment policy being fronted and taking center stage. And this is also informed by Kenya's history, hosting history, where over time, with all the uncertainties and so on that come with hosting, Kenya has increasingly adopted what we call the encampment policy in all its forms. So what I see in the Shirika plan is a continuation of the encampment policy, in a different form. It doesn't say that when we talk about settlements, I see encampment, because nothing defines those settlements. But remember the policies and the enactments and the proposals that I've mentioned, all of them, do not speak or do not address questions around encampment and the separation of refugees and hosts. So what does this mean for social cohesion? When I look at all these policy enactments and proposals, I see that there's a shortcoming in terms of a deliberate focus on social cohesion. Something else I see is that there's no robust policy that addresses social cohesion amongst refugees and hosts in the country as such. Therefore, this means that law is disjointed. on matters social cohesion. A close look at the Shirika plan, we also see that it does not focus on cohesion. If you look at the pillars that I mentioned, there's a mention of social inclusion, but nothing much about social cohesion. Instead, actually, the Shirika plan talks about tension between refugees and hosts. It only mentions that. Actually, when you look at the 70-page document, cohesion is only mentioned once. When you look at the entire document, and you can correct me on that. So it is therefore a bit superficial. When we look at the CIDPs, the County Integrated Development Plans, when we look at KISLEP, when we look at GISLEP, cohesion is only mentioned in passing. When you look at all those plans, cohesion is only mentioned in passing, and not a lot of attention is given to it. The Shirika plan, for example, looks at cohesion in two contexts. One, within the refugee community itself, and two, in terms of the integrated settlements, which I have also mentioned that is problematic. What does this mean for programming and implementation? It means that we therefore begin to see or witness what I call disjointed programming, disjointed implementation by different actors, not just government, but also by different actors, because it is expected that the humanitarian actors will therefore would interpret what we have in law to be able to do what? To make implementation. So it is left to everyone to, figure out what social cohesion is. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So far we've talked about what social cohesion means, what it looks like, what it looks like in the context of Tanzania. We've looked at it from the context of Kenya with a kind of national policy perspective. And now we're going to turn to Andrew for some reflections on a kind of key issue around social cohesion, which is measuring. Measuring, monitoring, evaluation, that came up a lot when we were doing our research on social cohesion. Andrew's going to talk us through that in the context of your work at REDS and in the context of Somalia. So can you tell us about the Urban Inclusivity Index that you've been working on in Somalia? Can you tell us about this index and its relevance for gauging social relations among Somali IDPs? Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. And also my fellow panelists. I think I'm also learning as well. So with the Urban Inclusivity Index, so this is based on research that was conducted some time back in 2019 by an American professor and Somali academic. And it was developed as a framework to understand who is included and who is excluded in Somalia based on which clan they come from. And it is based on this general observation in Somalia that in the absence of the state, after the collapse of the Said Barre regime, the clan was the arbiter, the sort of entity that provides protection, economic, social, and political protection. And also, again, as a legacy of the conflict, these clans became a bit insular because it's one clan against another, and therefore you have to protect your own. Over time, these clans gained enough power and influence to control territories. So territory in Mogadishu is under a specific clan, territory in Baidoa, a specific clan, and so on and so forth. Now, what then that means in terms of social cohesion and inclusion is that if you come from Clan A in Territory A, then you are more likely to access rights than if you come from Clan B and you're in Territory A's sort of domain. And this index has a set of 12 rights ranging from freedom of movement and residence to employment in the public sector. So if you come from Baidoa, for instance, and your clan comes from there and you go to Mogadishu, it is less likely that you have freedom of movement and residence anywhere in Mogadishu because that's under a different clan lineage. And therefore, this tool essentially tells us who is likely to access these rights in, say, in Mogadishu, and who is not. And it also gives us an understanding of why this happens. So, in terms of its the relevance around gauging social relations within the ADP settings, as well as generally, number one, it helps us to understand the levels of marginalization. The issue with clan dynamics in Somalia is that it's very fluid. And currently what a lot of actors have been doing is this thing they call clan mapping. So essentially mapping out which clans live in particular settlements and so on. But then the challenge with that is that it only gives you a snapshot in time and doesn't really tell you much in terms of who is included and who is excluded, because it is based on the assumption that if you come from clan X and you're in clan Y, then you are automatically excluded, which is not the case. The social relations are very complex, and also include elements where clans, particularly minority clans, have certain resources that they can use to negotiate with majority clans, and they can be adopted. So there's a process in Somali, I think, called Shegad, where dominant clans would adopt minority clans and therefore extend that protection to that minority clan, which would be invisible to clan mapping, because then that generally tells you which clan is a resident in what particular location. And then because of that also, there are also elements around how IDPs are seen in Somalia. IDP is particularly a loaded term, politically loaded term in Somalia, because then it is used as a way of othering. In certain locations, if you come from a minority group and you are in, say you're in Mogadishu, but you are a resident there, but your clan doesn't have power, then you are called IDP as a way of sort of excluding you from access to whatever rights that are attendant for people who live in that location. And therefore, this tool, sort of understanding who is included, who's excluded based on what rights they have, provides us with a clear understanding of how on how we can program in a way that is conflict sensitive, in a way that even though we are not necessarily directly engaged in addressing marginalization, that we ensure how we position aid resources within those particular spaces. One incentivizes dominant clan groups to invite minority groups into conversations and negotiations around how resources are to be distributed. And then two, it also looks at how we can resource minority groups to become, to sort of advocate for themselves. So as an example, is if there are certain clans in Somalia that are marginalized based on the work that they do, right? So if you're a blacksmith, you are sort of seen like in lower caste, and if you are a pastoralist, you're sort of seen like noble and so on. But if you're a blacksmith producing your working metal, producing knives, djembes or whatever, which are instruments that everyone uses, including majority groups. And therefore, this is something that they can see that they can derive value from, and therefore are more likely to include you in meaningful participation processes because of what you can provide for them. I know it's quite transactional at times, but that is how things are. Again, to the point around the political context of the politics around social cohesion in Somalia. That is how things are structured as at now. So those are that's the sort of key thing around this index, and essentially we are in the process of trying to pilot it to see how well it will operate, as well as supporting our members to look at how they can develop policies and programs that if they're not entirely or overtly aimed to reduce the marginalization, at least they don't increase the same. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Perfect, 5 minutes. Okay, so for our last intervention, we're going to turn to Corey. Corey, as part of your research in Kenya and Lebanon, you've been looking at how humanitarians promote refugee-host relations. Building on your findings, can you tell us a bit more about what you think the role of humanitarian and development actors should be when it comes to addressing social cohesion and displacement? Over to you.
No, I won't answer that. But in moving toward answering that, what I'd like to do is sort of discuss where the mandate comes from for promoting social cohesion. And as you mentioned, the research that I was doing was focused on both Kenya and Lebanon, and looking at the very many different ways that different aid actors, as well as development actors, are promoting social cohesion. And I mean, the one thing that really came out of my research, we did extended interviews with about 50 organizations in Lebanon and 50 in Kenya. And it was what really stood out was the range of ways that social cohesion is defined, that there are so many different kinds of interventions or ways that it's defined. And that I think that's part of the point, is if you're trying to think about whether an organization should engage in social cohesion, it depends on how you're defining it. And I think one thing that I'll bring out that comes from the sort of lit review of our work was that social cohesion in the refugee space, especially regarding refugees and their relationships with host communities, is still being defined. It's not a term that has been around for a very long time. I went to RefWorld, one of the online databases for refugee documents, and I did an extended search going back to the 1980s up until about 2020, and looked at what proportion of refugee documents during those different time periods included some mention of social cohesion. Throughout the 80s and 90s, almost nothing. Throughout the 2000s, you start to see some mention of social cohesion, but it's almost always in regard to repatriation to country of origin and reintegrating. So sort of rebuilding after war in the Balkans, or after the genocide in Rwanda. Some mention increasingly of integration and social cohesion in destination countries, especially in the EU and the US. It was really only around after 2010 that social cohesion started coming into policy for host countries. So the point I'm making there is that it's not, I think we're still in the process of defining this term and what it means. So where does the mandate come from, or where does the definition come from? To some degree, there's some mandate in SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is promoting just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. A lot of what's in SDG 16 has to do with social cohesion. Of course, this is a development goal, but if we're understanding that increasingly in refugee policy, we're aiming to bridge the humanitarian development gap, then that's still very useful to what aid actors are doing. Now, if we're looking more specifically to refugee policy, the start of social cohesion moving into refugee policy was actually largely around the Syria conflict. So during the conflict in Syria, a lot of refugees, millions, were moving into neighboring countries, and there was a lot of concern about making sure that this didn't destabilize those countries. And so this concern about the burden on host communities became a big issue. And this is not something that's been new for Kenya, right? This has been a big concern for example, the Turkana community in Turkana around the Kakuma camp since at least the 1990s. But this is sort of where we start to pull some of the work around social cohesion out. So whenever this response happened to the Syria crisis, almost every neighboring country around Syria started a number of different sectors that were aiming at dealing with the humanitarian response, and almost all of the countries in that area developed a social cohesion sector. So this is the first time that it sort of became a formal part of refugee policy in host communities. If we're trying to think then about what this means to reduce the burden on host communities, we've seen some aspects of this that are very clear. So one of the biggest complaints among Turkana pastoralists living around the Kakuma camp is the environmental damage that's been caused by the presence of the Kakuma refugee camp. So we can see a clear example of a burden on the host community, especially in an area where so many people rely on local vegetation for their herds. There's also a warning that comes here, though, which is that in many cases, this idea of the burden on host communities tends to sort of indicate that the suggestion is that the presence of refugees is causing this burden. The reality in many of the areas where we have this burden on burden on the host community is that these communities were already disenfranchised in some way. So there's a bit of, in some ways, maybe there's a warning here that the social cohesion narrative shouldn't necessarily suggest that all of these problems started with refugees, because that plays into the potential narratives that scapegoat a lot of problems in countries on refugees. I think the one thing that's really clear in a lot, and I heard it from Andrew, One thing that's really clear in a lot of these things is that aid agencies are not necessarily, and I think this is increasingly becoming something that a lot of aid agencies are very aware of, are not standing sort of outside of the situation and looking in ready to intervene, but they're already very much a part of the local politics of the areas where they're working. And that's why conflict sensitivity is so important. So the most fundamental part of what social cohesion is probably dealing with the role that aid agencies already have and the ways that their activities can potentially increase or decrease tensions. And any activity that they're going to do is probably going to affect both. And I'll end here my last comment just with an example of how there's sort of no clear, in almost any case where you're dealing with this politics of aid, you're always going to be having multiple effects on the situation on the ground. So increasingly, there's been in Turkana, an attempt to sort of make sure that the local host community is benefiting in various ways from the presence of aid in that region, the presence of refugee aid. On the one hand, whenever there was the most recent attempt to close the camps in 2020, we saw the national government making a lot of threats about moving refugees out of the camps, moving refugees back to their countries of origin. And actually, the Turkana County government moved in the opposite direction. It was understood here that the presence of refugees could, in many cases, be a win-win situation. And there were many statements among local county officials about, sort of downplaying the threats of moving refugees out of the camp. Potentially a negative side of this, though, is that because refugees are increasingly seen as a benefit locally, the prospects for decampment or ending the encampment policy are potentially actually hindered because increasingly the presence of a refugee camp in that area is seen as profitable or beneficial. So no clear yes or no answer to whether that's a good thing. It's just understanding the multiple effects that these aid interventions have, many of which go under this label of social cohesion.
Great. Thanks, Corey. And no expectations of a yes or a no answer to any of these questions around social cohesion. Okay, so we've had our interventions from the panelists, and I think we can all agree that those were brilliant interventions, really touching on a wide array of different aspects of social cohesion and looking at it from different perspectives and different countries within East Africa. It's now time for the Q&A. We've got about half an hour, so feel free to put up your hand and I will pass you a mic, or someone in the room will help to pass you a mic. When you ask your question, can I just ask that you start with your name and who you work for, and also mention whether the question is for someone particular on the panel or if it's a general question for everyone. If you're listening in online, please share your thoughts and questions in the Q&A box, and we will read out a selection of those questions as well. And likewise, please start with your name and the organization you work for and whether you want to dedicate the question to someone in particular. So we'll take several questions at a time. Does anyone in the room have a question to kick us off? Yeah, brilliant. I'll do it.
Hi, morning. My name is Dali. I use the pronouns they, them, and I'm an asylum seeker. And I have a couple of questions and some comments. And first, has anyone on the panel experienced displacement? I bet not. So I think there's a gap there. Maybe if someone who has lived a life of displacement, I think it would have given us better context. Otherwise, the submissions were quite fair. I liked how they noted out the notions around the host communities and how they feel about refugees, and not necessarily where they've been they've been saying refugees are the problem around social cohesion. Yeah, but at least you were very fair in that. And then when the question around what causes the differences in how social cohesion plays in the different host communities, and does the reason for asylum play a role, and how does that come out? Like the reason for my asylum seeking, how do they affect how social cohesion happens in the host communities. And the other goes directly to, I'm forgetting the name, who talked about the policies and stuff, the Shirika plan. And I'm thinking the Shirika plan versus the encampment policy. And you are very right around that disconnection in how refugee protection is handled by the different agencies. Because now DRS might refuse to give some people decisions, whereas the government has gazetted all these documents. But for example, the private sector, you got Safaricom and I want to get a SIM card because I have an asylum seeker pass, but the government is really pushing for that. In the regulations, they called it integration, local integration. And I think when they're doing these policies, like the displaced persons should be like part of that, because they are living with these people and they are having this refugee status. Then lastly, but not least, I'm thinking when you talk about social cohesion and only looking at the humanitarian agencies, how about them co-creating these solutions with the displaced persons? Someone mentioned about how the Karamajong do it in Uganda, and I think it's the community of these women who are bringing the peace and all that. How about now empowering the refugees to be doing that instead of, red JSS coming through or refugee point or like UNHCR thinking that they're going to force host communities to, to socially integrate with those people. For example, you can't talk about social and you don't talk about cultures, languages. I've not had a comment around that, around social cohesion. For example, in Uganda, in a Ugandan home, if you're a visitor, in 3 days, you can't even do any chores and what. But after 3 days, if we are waking up to go and dig, you're going to join us. So as we envision this social cohesion, I think we need to even get back to that. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we had about 5 or 6 questions in that first round. Thank you. So why don't we start with those and maybe we can just go through the panelists. Corey, do you want to start? You've got a mic in your hand. Yep.
Sure. Well, I'll just briefly comment on one of the last points you pointed out. I think many of the questions here were thinking of what's conventionally the aid sector, which is international organizations. And your point was that what is the role of refugee-led or local organizations in this, which in the case of Karamajong has been probably the most important factor. And I would just back that point, that especially since 2020 and this sort of call for localization, there has been more attention to this issue. I know that in Kakuma, groups like SIRS, which are refugee-led organizations, have been playing more of a role in social cohesion. Of course, they still have limited capacity because there's limited funding for that. I think one of the things that really needs to come out of research in regard to the role of RLOs is how funding structures can empower them on the one hand, but also potentially limit what they can do in the social cohesion space. Because a lot of times funding for RLOs, of course, comes with a lot of limitations on what they're able to do. But yeah, thank you for that intervention, I would say.
No, just to appreciate your intervention, I think is very important. You've raised a number of questions. I've taken note of them. But I think on this question, Jane Marie and Michael Owiso will have more to say.
Thank you so much for your questions. And I'll take the question on the reasons for fleeing, whether they affect social relations in the country of asylum. Yes, we found that. For those who had fled for political reasons, for example, who felt unsafe even in host countries, tended to avoid social relations. And we found some of these in places like Dar es Salaam, for example. But another thing we learned, and I remember this from Nyarugusu, reasons for fleeing affect relations between refugees themselves. And in a camp setting like Nyarugusu, we had, I remember several interviewees who preferred to be closer, have better social relations with natives, host community members than refugees, because they felt like they cannot have any good relations with fellow refugees because maybe they're persecutors, they're coming from different groups from back home and so on and so forth. So that also determines. And from the host perspective, especially where refugees flee generalized violence, there's that feeling that refugees are inherently violent. They're the people who are violent, who would kill each other. They've been killing each other back home, one another back home. So they look at refugees as dangerous. We also found this in villages near Nyarugusu camp. I remember specifically in something that I continue thinking about it when a host community member asked us a question. When you talk about refugees, are you referring to these refugees from Burundi, or are you referring to other groups as well? And I wanted to understand which other groups she was mentioning. And she mentioned a tribe in Tanzania called Sukuma. They are pastoralists and hence nomads. So they would move from one place to another with their herd of cows and all that, settle there for years. And this lady called them, said these are also like refugees because they are brutal even more than refugees. So her description of refugees, even the term refugee, was people who are brutal. And that's why she thought even Sukuma are refugees or should be called refugees. So with that kind of perception of who refugees are, definitely you can understand the nature of the kind of social relations that would come out of that. Let me just end there for now.
Well, thank you. It was not more of a question, but I would want to add something onto that in relation to policy and what I call policy incoherence, where we have, the list of enactments that I've mentioned, the proposals that I've mentioned. But at the same time, in the country, we also experience different kinds of rhetoric from the leadership. So from time to time, we have had, pronouncements about closure of camps and different kinds of pronouncements. We've had pronouncements around security issues, and that camps are the sources of insecurity, and so on and so forth. So all this combined leads to some kind of, let me say, uncertainty. And it takes me back to the slide by Babu earlier on what cohesion is, and the trust fades away. In our research with Cory in Kakuma, we, for example, found out that at that time when we were doing our research, the pronouncement about the closure of both Dadaab and Kakuma had just been made. And what was happening is that even those locals, hosts, who own shops and used to give different items on credit, stopped giving credit because they were not sure if the refugees were leaving or not, and whether upon leaving the refugees were going to pay. So it again touches on the same trust from what Bob was talking about earlier. It also then touches on the action, that probably there was already some action taken by both hosts and refugees towards, social cohesion, which then again is delta blow. So as we experience all these policy inconsistencies and policy incoherence, it also then has, tremendous effect on the cohesion that is already there or the cohesion that is building up. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe just a quick point on the last one. I think on the first few questions, I agree with my fellow panelists and I have nothing useful to add on those ones. But on the point around language, culture, and social cohesion, I think it's a mixed bag. It's neither. It's in some cases certain social norms and cultures are quite inviting and can be the basis upon which to build that social cohesion. But in other situations, they're a bit more exclusive, like in the case of Somalia, where they have these social institutional norms they call Tolnimo, which is basically a way of engaging with each other. So reciprocity, obligation to support during periods of need and so on. They vary depending on how far somebody is in terms of blood relations. So they start with the family, then kin, then the sub-clan. Then beyond that, the bonds become weaker and weaker, and people are less likely to support or help. So the thing here is, is also understanding the realities of the people on the ground and understanding the social and political structures of how people engage. And I think the point that you made around lived experience, I think is a good point. I have no defense. I have lived among people with lived experience, although I have not experienced that displacement myself. But it's a valid and fair point. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Should we take another round? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abubakar. I work for Voluntas Advisory. And I have two questions, one general and one specific to Mr. Corey. Okay, so first of all, generally referring to encampment as, I believe, a negative side of or like an obstacle to absolute social cohesion between hosts and refugees. What role do you think community safety play in social cohesion? And how can programs address these concerns without exacerbating the existing tensions, assuming there are existing tensions between the two communities? So this is a general question. And then the second question is that given that social cohesion as a concept, as you elaborated, is still an evolving concept, and given that challenges faced, given the challenges faced now to implement this concept, where do you think social cohesion as a concept is moving within the near future? Where do you see it going in the near future? Do you think that it is now at the culmination phase as a concept, or do you think that something else can still come that is further more than we consider now as social cohesion? That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take one more. It's you.
Thank you. So one, I think as you were discussing the definitions, I've been trying to read even on ChatGPT, different definitions of social cohesion. And for a second, from what I'm hearing and what I'm reading, let's consider that social cohesion is adults learning to make friends, right? Right? Let's simplify it to a child. It's teaching adults how to make friends, right? I think my question to you would be, is there an assumption being made that adults actually know how to do that? And then two, is the answer to institutionalize friendship making? Because example she gave in Tanzania, it's not where it is not institutionalized is where we're seeing it, right? And the reason I'm asking that question is because there's a tendency for aid organizations, governments to institutionalize these things. But I just don't know whether there's proof that says forcing people to make friends makes friends. Or could there be a different approach in terms of how do we create opportunities for connection, for belonging, for people engaging? And so should the shift be towards making more playgrounds as opposed to more policies, maybe? I'm really just keen to understand your view on that.
Thank you. Let's take one more. Yep.
Thank you. I tend to, pick my question from what the colleague has just mentioned, because I was trying to also to understand what comes first, the law or the situation? Because if you look at the refugee setting, when it existed before, you found that there are quite a number of people who really went to the camps to find people to marry, you know? The host community will go to the camps to find people to marry. The refugee community also found people from the host community to marry or stay together. But then when we started defining what relations is or what so-called social cohesion is, we kind of fit them into a box where they're trying to find themselves if they're ticking those particular boxes or fitting within government structures. When law comes to play, then they try then to separate what is already existing. So my question is, I mean, we tend to avoid what has been happening before when defining the law or defining policies. But we need to recognize the fact that what was happening before might have been working. And when we come up with law and policy, we might be separating this particular group who have been living together. They've found ways of doing it together. They found ways of engaging together in different cultural activities. So still the question is, the law or the situation? What comes first?
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a few questions, and I've also got some online, which I'll read out afterwards. But broadly speaking, there's a question around encampment and the role of community safety. Where is social cohesion going? It's an evolving concept. Should we be institutionalizing friendship making? And then the role of law and policy. To what extent should law build on what was already there? What comes first, chicken or the egg? I'll hand over to you, Andrew. Why don't you kick us off? Feel free to answer any of those that you like the look of.
Yes, I was looking away so that you don't pick on me first. Those are quite good questions. I must confess I wasn't prepared for difficult questions this morning, but nonetheless, I will attempt the questions as raised. Let me begin with the second question, chicken and egg, and whether we should institutionalize friendship making. For me, how I view some of these things from a very political economic lens. Who does it benefit for us to be doing certain things, right? So if the aim of social cohesion is that people peacefully coexist and stay in a particular location, rather than move elsewhere outside that location, we should be asking ourselves certain questions about who such policies benefit, right? Because sometimes the way in which social cohesion is applied is very artificial, I must confess. And I want to put people who are in different have different norms and institutions, and then sort of artificially trying to wedge them in. So essentially the point around creating playgrounds and essentially assuming that people are going to play nice. So the key thing there is to understand why is social cohesion important. On our end, social cohesion is important because it, in certain respects, provides certain rights and protection. Like in the case of Somalia, if you're in the out group, you are forever marginalized. You are unlikely to get resources to meet your basic needs. You are unlikely to end up in camps that have very limited infrastructure and so on and so forth. So that a level of engagement with the dominant group in that location is linked to the very survival of these displaced persons. So that is general. Whether it should be institutionalized, I don't think so. And again, it also goes to the wider point around when should aid actors step back. And I think this is one of those points that we really need to rethink why we are doing what we are doing and how we even measuring what we are doing. And because some of these instances, it causes more harm than good. An example is Dadaab, for instance. The clan groups that live in Garissa have relatives across the border. That border is more or less artificial. So the way they interact in Dadaab sort of mirrors what happens in Somalia. So if you go there and start doing institution and so on, without understanding how those clan dynamics operate, you are likely to cause more harm than good because the people who are excluded for a specific reason, and we need to understand that before we start tinkering there. Then the last comment around encampment being an obstacle to social cohesion. again, it's also a mixed bag. I can't use that one term to generalize how camps operate across the board, right? Given the different social relations and patterns across borders. Sometimes when you see a lot of these camps are very close to border areas, and the communities that live in those border areas have some sort of relation. So sometimes that camp might be a sort of a single point of accessing resources, like the point around closing Kakuma and Dadaab. People were up in arms because they felt that this is the only way in which we can access resources, because the state has more or less failed us, given the years of marginalization in some of these locations, in terms of accessing resources. But then that is also not to suggest that camps are there to protect the community from the refugees, right? I think we should also be very careful about the inherent assumptions that we would be making there, right? Again, points that Corey made around even the complaints around refugees and depleting resources and so on. Some of these locations had very limited resources to begin with. Now, the challenge as aid actors is that we tend to engage or target interventions based on population status. I am a refugee agency, and therefore I will focus on refugees and forget about everyone else who might be in the same need, or or even more needy than the refugee. That's not my problem. That's the government's problem, and that has been the attitude for a very long time. Now, there is another alternative of an area-based approach to some of these interventions, where you look at the whole population, both the refugees and the people in that the host community in that location, but you also look at what resources are available and how do we respond to not only the demand, the needs, but also how do we build those resources so that they can be able to sustain that need. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. We're running out of time, everyone. So I'm going to ask you to keep your answers a little bit brief, and then we can do one more round of questions before we close up.
Thank you. I'll try and keep it very brief. Context matters. And sometimes when we draw up policy and we draw up programs and so on, we tend to forget context. And that's a big problem we have, not just in this country, but all over. I see a lot of aid, donors, and so on. Some of these things are pushes, let me call them that way, from different sectors, particularly donors, that we want this in place. Right now, there's the recent funding from the IMF and World Bank to Kenya, and one of the conditionalities is social cohesion, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, good, but context matters. What's the history of these camps? What's the history of marginalization in Turkana and in Garissa? What's the cultural context? What are all these contexts we are speaking about, so that as we move towards drafting policy or all that, then we take all this into account. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go quickly on must we institutionalize social cohesion, or must we which comes first? What comes first, law or policies or situations? Reality is that people will just live, whether you put law there or not. We have seen in other situations where refugees and from camps and host communities enter into relationships where refugees would go work in the farms of the hosts and be paid in kind, and so on and so forth. And I remember in particular one local government official who was saying, praising that practice. And then another higher official saying, no, but the law doesn't allow that. And this local government official says, I'm telling you what is happening. I'm not telling you about the law. This is how we live with refugees. So in reality is that people will just engage, relate, and do whatever they want, regardless of what the law says. But laws are important, policies are important to facilitate that. Because the example I just gave you, this is something that is done illegally. And when this host community member and this refugee or these refugees are found, they're in trouble. So also it exposes refugees in this situation to different kinds of abuses, exploitations. And we have had stories where refugees will enter into such kind of agreements with host members, and that towards the end, when it's time to harvest, they're told, you either keep quiet or I report you that you came and worked on my farm without permission. So law is there. Law is important to ensure that all these now are good social relations that are stemming out of situations are made legal. There is no obstacle for them to have this kind of relations. That's my take.
Just a quick comment, and on a light note, you said your definition of social cohesion is adults learning, learning to make friends. On a personal note, I find that really interesting. I need to research some more. I grew up most of the time in this city. I know this city very well. And I decided a couple of years ago that I'm going to leave this city and go to Kilifi in coastal Kenya. And you can imagine the first time I've settled in Kilifi and I go to markets, I go to shopping centers and places, and everybody is greeting me. Shikamoo, ujambo mzee. Do you know the Nairobi in me had difficulty with that. And you enter into a matatu, if you're traveling from where I am going to Mombasa, someone has, the roasted nuts or something, they share with you. And you can imagine how the Nairobi in me was just so shocked. Point I'm trying to make is, let's think about just how our lifestyles have been fragmented to a level where if I meet my sister and I greet her, I mean, if you go to downtown Nairobi now, by the way, try greeting anybody and you'll see the reaction, the fragmentation that has just happened. And I think that's what happened. Adulthood and the process we go through just take away the child from us, who naturally and organically knows connection is where you find joy. Connection is where you engage, find solutions. Once in a while, you're going to quarrel, but you'll find ways to resolving it and so on and so forth. Some or rather, our lifestyles, our social engagements, even our politics have just fragmented that. So yes, it's learning how to be children again. And that we can sing, we can greet, we can resolve issues together, we can play. And out of that play, we create stories and we find ways of resolving our problems and making our lives better.
I remember the first time I came to Nairobi from Tanzania and I was trying to say shikamoo to everyone and they were just staring at me like, what's wrong with you? So really quickly, I'll address the second question that you asked. So the pessimistic answer, I guess, which isn't necessarily what I would hold to, would be that it's just a buzzword, and that these things just keep coming in and they gain currency and then we move past them. And this perspective would say that social cohesion is just what used to be peace education, maybe in the past. So dealing with these tensions. So that's one way of looking at it. As an anthropologist, and I have an interest in linguistics, which has to do with the power of words. I think that every time these new words come in, they bring with them something. And so I guess to answer the part of your question, which said, where's it going? I would maybe say where I hope it goes is that it's the meaning of social cohesion in refugee policy, which is still developing, would start taking from what social cohesion meant when it came into when it was being used a lot in the 1990s as a form of national policy. At that time, there were a lot of countries, and it was especially in Europe, the US, Canada, that were experiencing increased migration to their countries, increasing diversity. And their interest in social cohesion was to make their countries more tolerant of that diversity so that they could maintain a sense of society that wasn't based on one ethnicity or one race or something like that. I think that one way that it would be really nice if I think it shifted is that we increasingly hear of this horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension. So the horizontal is the between groups, between communities, the vertical is maybe between the state and institutions and the people that they're supposed to serve. So accountability, trust in institutions. I feel like social cohesion and refugee policy has increasingly become divided into those two components, as if they're two different components. That wasn't the way that it was thought of in the 1980s and 1990s in a lot of national policies. Anything that had to do with people's acceptance of other people and their perspective of other people had to do with politics and trust in institutions. Because if you felt you were already excluded, of course, you're not going to be accepting of newcomers. And I think that that's actually something that should really be a part of social cohesion policy. So the answer to your question is, I think we shouldn't, and I guess it's maybe also answering your question. My view on that issue is that it isn't just about making different groups get along. All of that is already also part of the politics of aid. So that would be maybe a direction I would hope that it would go.
Thanks, Corey. I reckon we've got time for one more really quick round if anyone has a last burning question. I think there were some hands up before. Yeah.
In the context of the plan-based humanitarian programming, but also, policy framework.
Yeah, make it quick. Yeah, my name's Matt Stevens. I'm with the World Bank. So question, I think it was for Mike. You said the Sharika plan had one mention of cohesion. Hello? Oh, no, it's working now. Yeah, maybe I pressed the button. Yeah, do you think that the absence of social cohesion in the Sharika plan, do you think it was a deliberate oversight? It's not me. Maybe inspired by the kind of thinking that you shouldn't dabble in things which are so complicated and highly varied across a different context in Kenya, that maybe it was, let's not touch on that. Or do you think it was something that should have been in there and there should have, I think, for instance, Somalia National Commission for Refugees and IDPs has a social cohesion policy, and they thought that through carefully. So that's a quick question. Second question, I didn't hear from the panelists any response to the quick presentation from Caitlin, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the proposed conditions, if and when aid actors should step back from engaging in this. And I heard your conclusion, Corey, around lots of different definitions of social cohesion, what it is that people think they're doing, then different ways, therefore, of measuring it, different ways of saying it's been achieved or not. And certainly in the World Bank, I see that kind of a continuum from a whole lot of kind of fairly naive or maybe overly ambitious efforts where we say putting any kind of development resources into conflict or fragile areas will be a good thing. And then there are some where it's completely overlooked. We just put resources into contexts without thinking about the social implications. And then there are others where it's done very well, where we have in-depth social analysis and we think these things through carefully. So I see the same as highly varied and not a lot of really in-depth knowledge on the issue or kind of consistent or coherent attempts to kind of grapple with it. I think we're trying to move in that direction, which is partly why I'm here, to kind of hear what others are doing. But I didn't hear any of your reflections on these conditions and thoughts on stepping back, and I would be interested to hear some.
Thank you. Okay.
Quite quickly, my name is Lilian Obie with the International Detention Coalition, and my question is to Corey. The comments you had on the changing definitions and the fact that we don't have one understanding of what social cohesion is, does that then limit our understanding of what social cohesion is? Could there be some communities that are already living peacefully, but we don't know it because we don't have one single understanding? And then because we don't have one single understanding of what social cohesion is, it's very fluid. There are key markers or indicators to measure it, and that goes also to Andrew for the monitoring and the evaluation.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes. So we have questions around social cohesion's linkages to self-reliance. We have a question around the Sharika plan. We have a question around Should aid actors step back and under what conditions? We have another question around definitions. We had a couple of questions online. One around, maybe these are too big to get into, but I'll just say them because I think they're good questions. One around the negative impacts of research on undocumented refugees. So this idea of doing research on social cohesion, interviewing people who are undocumented, and what risks and exposures can that put them to? More of a more general research question. And then maybe another one, which I'm not sure we'll have time to answer, but we've talked about refugee-host relations. What about refugee-refugee relations as well? So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to pick maybe one question, and then we'll wrap up.
Right. So given I'm first, I'll take the easiest one. On the question of social cohesion and self-reliance, in the context of Somalia, in certain situations, it can be the determining factor to whether somebody survives or not. So, for instance, in this previous drought, this recent drought, the one that ended sort of last year, we saw those IDPs that had greater social capital, had greater well-connected, who have resources and so on, fared better than those ones that did not. So for us, the why, because that's essentially what all this boils down to, is that social cohesion, social capital is relevant for self-reliance, and therefore the programming should be able to sort of support that with that sort of objective in mind. Yep.
Thank you. On whether the commission on social cohesion in the Shirika plan, I am not sure. It is possible that it's deliberately omitted, but it's possible that also the drafters did not think through it, but we are raising it.
Social cohesion and self-reliance, definitely, we found that there is a correlation there. Most of the respondents felt that social relations or social cohesion was important, was necessary for them to be able to cater for their daily needs and be able to work. Even the example I gave was more on working in a host community's farm. So there's a correlation there. Undocumented refugees, risks and exposures. It's a very good question, yes. And this is a consideration that we always take when we do that, when we research this group, because we are driven by the do no harm principle. So we have that in mind, and we make sure that in whatever we do with them, we don't expose them to any risks. Refugee relations, I will not respond to it, but we have in Nyarugusu, we had interesting findings on that as well.
Yeah, since no question was really directed to our approach, I'll yield my time to any panelist who wants to add something.
Maybe I just mentioned something very small around the policy and policy process in Kenya. Ideally, we should have had a plan first, then we talk about a policy, and then we move to the act. But what we did in Kenya, because of exigencies I may not understand, is that we started with the act, then we went to the plan, and now recently we are hiring someone to do the policy. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amnesty. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe also I should use this time to say something about refugee relations that we found. So the Nyarugusu camp is hosting Congolese and Burundian refugees. And for us, we asked questions about their relations as well. And we found that their relation is mainly determined by the policies around the two groups. Not necessarily written policies, but how the two groups are viewed. And so Burundians are viewed as a group that is supposed to go back home, while Congolese are viewed as a group that is on transition to resettlement. And this has brought a lot of interesting factors that are determining their relations in the camps.
Yeah, so just a really quick response to your question. So I don't think that we necessarily need one definition. And I would actually say that one of the reasons that I think social cohesion became so useful in policy for a while was that for a while, no one really knew exactly what it meant. So people could actually throw it around in the room and sort of have consensus around the same term, even though they all maybe meant slightly different things. So actually the flexibility may have been part of the reason that the term initially really gained traction. And I would also just say that having different definitions, again, it's not necessarily a problem. The key is just that it's fit to purpose, that the definition you're using at a particular time is directed at the particular problems you're addressing. Or as you said, the concerns of or ideas of cohesion of the people in that area who are, living in that context. And maybe just the last point is on this issue about stepping back. I do think that that's an important part of the sort of a conflict-sensitive approach to social cohesion. The other aspect of what you bring up is this issue of maybe not always making social cohesion its own first objective, but making it a part of many other programs. When we did a lot of case studies in Lebanon and Kenya, one of the things we observed was, in line with what you said, that a lot of times when social cohesion was an implicit part of other areas of programming, like livelihood programs, where the main purpose was to promote livelihoods, but they also brought people together to interact in a cooperative way. That was where you heard the best stories about breaking down stereotypes or developing bonds. The ones that were, about bringing people together from different groups and telling them they should get along were often not so useful. So just backing that point.
Thank you. I guess that puts us back in the realm of playgrounds for adults and orchestrating adult friendships. We're already over time, sadly, so we're going to draw it to a close there. But it actually isn't the end of it. So for those of you who are online, this is the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you who are here in the room with us, we're going to take a quick coffee break, and then we're going to resume for another second session, which is very much about this kind of, so what next for aid actors? What does this all mean for aid actors? So I would really warmly encourage you to stay with us. We have some very nice samosas and some nice coffee, and there will also be some lunch at the end, just to, if that encourages you to stay. So please do stay with us, but maybe we can say a huge thank you to our panelists for their brilliant interventions. I've been studying social cohesion for a couple of years, but I found that really fascinating and I learned tons, and it really helped to reinforce some of my own thinking. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for joining us. Bye.